we've done several fascinating interviews together.
Michelle has always had veto power.
I should use it more.
And let me tell you this, she is everything you think she is, and then some.
Words matter. What we say, how we behave, we are modeling to the next generation.
Today, a new conversation, our first interview since she left the White House. At the Hearst Tower in New York, we sat down with an audience that included a group of girls from a local high school. You know, Michelle and I both love a chance to talk with rising young women.
We have to feel that optimism for these kids. We have to hand them hope.
The world has been waiting to read her new memoir, Becoming, and let me tell you, it's worth the wait. I loved it so much, I chose it as my latest book club selection. Michelle writes exquisitely about everything we all wanted to know, from her humble childhood to meeting and being courted by Barack Obama.
That's my honey.
There are revelations about their marriage.
You were mad.
I was mad.
And her thoughts on President Trump.
It wasn't true, and he knew it wasn't true.
When she served our country as the 44th First Lady, she did it with such dignity, grace, and style. Not one scandal, not a misstep. She was the epitome of what a First Lady could be. When you read Becoming, you'll also learn that she's really just like all of us. And at her core, she's still a girl from the South Side of Chicago.
Please welcome Mrs. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama to the stage. Yes, you. Yes. Mwah. Love you. Love you. Thank you for this. Hey, guys. How are you guys doing? Look at these ladies. Thank you so much. Oh, let me just say, as you know, I love books. Nothing makes me happier than sitting down with a good read. And so when I started to read this and realized, like, in the preface, what an extraordinary book was forthcoming, I was so proud of you. May I say, you landed it. You landed it. The book is tender, it is compelling, it is powerful, it is raw. And I was struck actually by the beautiful cover, Becoming Michelle Obama. So struck that I have now made it an Oprah's book club. And I have to tell you, I think this is our 79th book choice. And Lee Haber, who's editor of books, I said, Lee, I love this book so much, but Michelle and I are friends. I don't know, can I do that? How's that gonna look?
Yeah,
and she said, but do you love the book? I go, I love the book. I love the book so much that I don't just want to choose it as my book club. I want all the book clubs around the world to choose it as their book club so that we're all reading it at the same time. So Reese and Emma and Jimmy Fallon and all of the great book clubs. Why did you choose the word becoming? Because when I was like 18, 19, I wrote this poem, bad poem, on becoming, because of this notion of evolving. And I know you had a choice for multiple titles.
We actually had a blooper list of titles that we won't go into. A lot of things that would be funny, only to us. But Becoming just summed it all up. In the preface, you recall one of the things I say that is a question that adults ask kids that I hate. I think it's the worst question in the world is, what do you want to be when you grow up? As if growing up is finite, as if you become something and that is all there is. And my journey is the journey of always continually evolving, that there is never a point where you arrive at a thing. And if you do, that's kind of sad. You know, if you think that there is a point in your life where you stop growing and stop learning, that's sort of sad because what else is left?
You know, I never thought of it that way before until I read that question. So I've never asked anybody that since. What do you want to be when you grow up? Because you grow up and you are many different things, as you have been many different things.
And I don't know what the next step will be. And I tell young people that all the time who are trying to figure it all out, because you think at some point you just know that there's going to be a light that turns off in your 20s, or, you know, all young women here probably have some magic age of what number you'll be when you'll feel like a grown-up. you know, and that's generally when you think your mother will stop telling you what to do. But the truth is that for me, each decade has just uncovered something amazing that I would have never imagined.
And it keeps getting better, I have
And
to
if
say.
I had stopped looking, I would have missed out on so much. So I'm still becoming, and I hope all of us know that we are constantly evolving. So this is the story of my journey of becoming, and hopefully it will spark conversations among a lot of people, especially young people, about what their journeys look like.
You know, there's so many private revelations in this book that I was surprised by. And I was wondering, was writing about your private life, was that scary? And did you lose sleep about, oh, I'm going to put that in, no, I'm going to take that out, no, I'm going to put that in?
Yeah, actually, no. Because here's the thing that I realize. People always ask me, why is it that you're so authentic? Mm-hmm. How is it that people connect to you? And I think it starts because I like me. And I like my story. And all the bumps and bruises, the highs and the lows, I'm not afraid of them. I sort of think that that's what makes me uniquely me. So I've always been open with my staff, with young people, with my friends. There isn't much people who know me don't know about me, because I'm so used to sharing that part of me, because I think that even the tough spots are important for me to examine and explore. So it wasn't hard. And the other thing, Oprah, that I know that whether we like it or not, Barack and I, my husband and I, we are role models.
Yep.
And, you know, I hate when people who are in the public eye and even seek the public eye want to step back and say, well, I'm not a role model because I don't want that responsibility. Too late, you are. And that means that young people are looking at you. And I don't want young people to look at me here and now as Michelle Obama and think, well, she never had it rough. She never had challenges. She never had fears. She never got...
Well, we're not going to think that after reading this book.
Oh, no, you're not.
No, we're not going to think that at all. I love the way you divide the sections into becoming me, becoming us, and becoming more. And millions of people have been wondering how you are, how you're doing, how the transition. And I think in your story of becoming, in the very beginning of the book, that there's no better example of how you are than the toast story. Can you share the toast story?
It's probably one of the first weeks that we moved into our new home after the transition, in our new home in Washington. And we live in a really nice neighborhood. Let me just say this, but it's a couple of miles away from the White House, right down the street from the Vice President's residence. And it's a beautiful brick home, and you know, you sort of realize this is the first home, regular house, with a door and a doorbell that I have had in about 8 years. So the toast story is one of the first nights I was alone by myself, with no one there. The kids were out, Malia was on her gap year, I think Barack was traveling, and I was alone for the first time, which, as First Lady, you're not alone much, because there are people in the house always. There are men standing guard. There is a house full of SWAT people, and you can't open your windows, and you can't walk outside without causing a fuss. You know, I lived in this bubble for 8 years, and
you can't open a window.
Can't open a window, not without a really big conversation, which Sasha actually tried to do one day. It was Sasha and Malia, they both, because their rooms face the north side of the White House where all the protesters are. And Malia said, I enjoy studying to the sound of the protesters. She said, Mom, I've been listening to them, and a couple of them have a few good points. I talk to Dad, but you know, then we got the call, shut the window. So here I am in my new home, and it's just me and Bo and Sonny, and I do a simple thing. I go downstairs and open the cabinet to my own kitchen, which you don't do in the White House, because there's always somebody there going, let me get that. What do you want? What do you need? And I made myself toast, and I made myself cheese toast. And then I took my toast, and I walked out into my backyard. I opened my door, and I stepped outside to fresh air. And I sat on the stoop, and there were dogs barking in the distance, and I realized how Bo and Sonny reacted because I realized they had really never heard neighbor dogs either.
They thought they were the
sorta
only
like,
dogs in the universe.
They're like, oh, what's that? I was like, yep, we're in the real world now, fellas. And it's that quiet moment of me settling into this new life, you know, having time to think about what just happened over the last 8 years, because what I came to realize is that there was absolutely no time to reflect on the 8 years we were in the White House. We moved at such a breakneck pace from the moment we walked into those doors until the moment we left. It was day in and day out, because Barack and I really felt like we had an obligation to get a lot done. So we were busy, and we were raising kids, and we were dealing with national crises, and we were trying to console, and we were trying to heal and help. And, you know, you'd look up Monday what happened, and I would forget on Tuesday what happened on Monday. I forgot whole countries I visited, literally whole countries. But there was no time to reflect. And so this was the moment that I had time to think about these 8 years and my journey of becoming.
But in reading Becoming, I can see how every single thing, because I do believe this, that everything you're doing right now in your life, in your classroom, is preparing you for the moments and years ahead. And
That's if you think about it that way.
Yeah.
You know, and I really want you girls to understand this. If you view yourself as a serious person in the world, not having fun, but the truth is every decision that you make really does build to who you are going to become.
Yes, and I can see that from you in the first grade, that you were an achiever with an A+++.
Well, my mother said I was a little extra, so I was a little extra.
Yes, and so you write in the book how getting those little gold stars. I don't think you get gold stars anymore, right? No.
They don't even have books. I don't know. What do you guys? Everything's on a computer. You get a star on your computer.
That those gold stars meant something to you.
Yeah, I mean, in looking back on those stories, I realized there was something about me that understood context and understood even at a young age. And I think I talk a lot about my parents' parenting and how they sort of gave us the freedom to have a voice and to have thoughts and ideas very early on. And I say this to parents, it's like, you know, teaching your kids their voice starts the minute they can hear your voice. My parents took that responsibility pretty seriously. So I was aware of my surroundings.
And they basically let you and Craig figure it out.
Oh gosh, yeah, they did. They did sometimes painstakingly so. But, you know, what I realized was that achievement mattered and that kids would get tracked early. And that if you didn't demonstrate, particularly as a black kid on the South Side from a working class background, people were already ready to put you in a box of underachievement. So for me, even at a very early age, not achieving what I needed to achieve, I didn't want people to think that I wasn't a hardworking kid. I didn't want them to think I was one of those kids, because I understood that people do tend to put kids into those kids. These are the bad kids. These are kids that don't want to learn. And what I talk about is the fact that there are no bad kids, there are bad circumstances.
And you mentioned this phrase that I like so much. I think it should be on a t-shirt or something. Failure, you say, is a feeling long before it becomes an actual result. It's a vulnerability that breeds with self-doubt and then is escalated, often deliberately, by fear. And that this idea actually stuck with me, that failure is a feeling long before it becomes an actual result. You knew this when?
Oh, first grade. I could see my neighborhood changing around me. I grew up, when we moved to my neighborhood, which was South Shore on the south side of Chicago, it was in the 1970s, way back, a long time ago. There was still TV, but only 7 channels. And when we moved there and lived with my great aunt in a very little apartment over a home she owned, because she was a teacher and my great uncle was a Pullman porter, so they were able to purchase a home in what was then a predominantly white community. But we came in at the period of transition, which historically has been known as white flight. And one of the things I try to do in my book is put context around my life So that's not just telling stories, but I want people to understand what was going on politically and socioeconomically.
But you do that so beautifully. You painted this picture. I could feel the space. There's you in Craig's room, and then there's the family space.
Well, our little play area.
Yes.
So our apartment was so small that probably what was the living room was divided up into 3 rooms. That 2 rooms were me and my brothers that fit like a twin bed, and it was wood paneling that separated us, and there was no real wall. You could talk right between. It was like, Craig, you up? It's like, I'm up, you up? We would throw a sock over the opening as a form of a game.
My I couldn't figure out where did the family actually meet other than the kitchen?
Well, there was another room outside that turned into the living room, but our bedroom was our 2 bedrooms and a little play area that became our study. And that house seemed so big when we were little, but it was a teeny little space. And my grandfather, who was a carpenter, my grandfather Southside, who I talk about, was a carpenter who did all the construction that you could imagine in all the houses that everybody owned.
But the pictures that you painted so beautifully in Becoming is that you all each were a part of a corner of the square, and that your family was the square. The 4 of you together represented that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I could feel that the pizzas and the ice cream that you got after, a great report card, the family sitting at the little table celebrating success.
Oh yeah, we lived a humble life, but it was a full life, and we didn't require much. If you did well because you wanted to do well. Yeah. We got a reward. Maybe it was pizza night or some ice cream. That was a clue from my parents that we had done well. Yeah. But in this neighborhood, I was saying that was changing. That was predominantly white when we moved in. By the time I went to high school, it was predominantly African American. And in the 70s, there's something known as white flight, where a lot of the white families would move out into the suburbs as black families moved in. And I actually grew up seeing that transition. I put some school pictures, class pictures in the book that shows my 1st grade class and then my 8th grade class that shows that flight happening. And those kids were our friends. I mean, I grew up when I was in kindergarten and 1st grade, I had friends of all backgrounds. My first kiss was a little boy, Teddy Ford, who was Korean American. One of my little friends was a little redhead named Susan, and a girl across the street, Rachel. All these kids were in my class.
But by the time you were in high school.
But the flight happened so quickly. It's like one day they were there, and the next day the white people were gone. And you started to feel the effects in the community, and you started to feel it in the school. I felt it as a 1st grader. I felt the disinvestment. And when we talk about failure as a feeling, this notion that kids don't know when they're not being invested in, this notion that when kids are in broken schools and in broken communities that they don't know, I'm here to tell you as a 1st grader, I felt it.
But one of the great indications of your personality to come was in the 1st grade. Was it 1st grade or kindergarten when you missed the word?
It was kindergarten.
It was kindergarten. You missed a word.
Right.
Tell us that story.
This was sort of like one of your first tests. You were supposed to be able to read your colors. And I came into kindergarten reading, of course. My mother took us to the public library. I knew how to read. I was a good reader. Spelling was still another thing, and but one of the first things you had to do was do sight readings and read your colors by, red, blue, hold up a card. Mrs. Burles, my kindergarten teacher, still remember her to this day. And it was my turn to get up, and I read the cards, red and blue, black, and then I got to white, and I froze. And it was the first time I remember choking, because it was a straight up choke. I mean, I knew the word, but I just couldn't spell it out.
The WH.
So I was getting there, and then it was like, sit down, and I didn't get my star. And I thought, this can't be, because I know how to read, and Mrs. Burles is gonna think that I'm one of the kids who can't read. And my 2 best friends got their stars that day. And I went home and I lost sleep over it. I talked to my mom, I said, I don't know what happened, I can read. And I mean, I couldn't read the word, and I know the word, and I have to go back and I have to prove myself because I felt like that would be a defining moment for me, that if I was one of the kids who couldn't read the words on the first try, that I'd be
labeled.
I'd be labeled.
Yeah.
So I went back and I argued with Mrs. Burroughs, who had no intention of rereading the words until next week. And I was like, oh no, Mrs. Burroughs,
We're doing this today.
We're doing this today. And I, you know, in recounting that story and thinking about it, it's like, well, who was I, this little kindergartner, to be like, I'm sorry, Mrs. Burroughs, I know we're supposed to have playtime, but I need to redo my words today. And I convinced her to let me do it, and pity the kids who had to sit there while I read those cards, but I got my star. And I was like, okay, life can go on. But that was very much me. And my mom will tell you this. It was like, she doesn't even know where that came from. I think she had way more to do with who I was than she gives herself credit for.
I think so too, because you say our parents invested in us. You know, they didn't own their own home.
They invested.
They didn't vacation. They didn't go. They invested everything in you.
My mom didn't go to the hairdresser. She did her own nails. I talk about one time when she turned her hair green, and it was like, Mom, all right, you can't do this. You can go to the hairdresser.
Yeah.
She didn't buy herself new clothes. She stayed home. She made sacrifices for us. My father was a shift worker. You know, I could see my parents sacrificing for us. It was apparent.
Did you know at the time it was sacrifice?
Maybe I wouldn't call it sacrifice at the time, and our parents didn't guilt trip us, but I had eyes, you know. I saw my father going to work in that uniform every day.
Your family did the same thing my family did. Your father had an electric 225, so did my father have an electric 225.
Deuce and a quarter.
Deuce and a quarter.
There's a whole section on the deuce and a quarter.
Deuce and a quarter. And driving around, looking at homes on the weekend, looking
we
at how
had our
other
little
people live.
aspirational moments where we'd get in the deuce and a quarter and we'd drive to the nicer neighborhoods and we'd look at the homes that had beautifully lined flowers and 2 cars in the driveway. I talk about a time when we visited one of the families who fled out, and we had an experience visiting one of our friends' families in a suburb, and it wasn't a positive experience,
Yes, when you came
leaving our neighborhood. But the deuce and the quarter for my father represents more than just a car, because my father was disabled. He had MS, and he had trouble walking for quite some time. And this is more reflective, knowing, now looking back, I could see how much this car meant to him, because this car was his wings.
Yes.
It gave him the ability to take us around in a way that he couldn't walk us around. So there was power in that car. That car was a metaphor for, I mean, they call it a little capsule that my family, we would be in, and we could see the world in a way that
like windows of the world. You know, the thing one of the things I was most impressed with, because I genuinely appreciated the way you were able to reveal so much of not just what happened to your family, but what's going on with all families. You know, we often talk about how systemic racism impacts generations, the way you write about your grandfather. For me,
which one? Because I was fortunate to grow up with 2 of them.
Yeah, it wasn't Southside.
Okay, Dandy.
Dandy. Okay. You write on page 38. I thought this was so beautiful. Gradually, he downgraded his hopes, letting go of the idea of college, thinking he trained to become an electrician instead. But this too was quickly thwarted. If you wanted to work as an electrician or as a steel worker, a carpenter or plumber for that matter, on any of the big job sites in Chicago, you needed a union card. And if you were black, the overwhelming odds were that you weren't going to get one. Discrimination altered the destinies of generations of African Americans, including many of the men in my family, limiting their income, their opportunity, and eventually their aspirations. First of all, I don't think I've ever heard a more gut-wrenching truth explained in such simple human terms. And did your parents sit you and Craig down at some point and explain that the world isn't always fair?
Oh yeah, we would have conversations all the time. I mean, and that section, I talk about my paternal grandfather. We called him Dandy. My whole family, by the way, we lived within a 5-block radius, and I lived downstairs from a great aunt. My mother's father lived 2 blocks away with aunts and uncles. My father's parents lived maybe 5 minutes away. And that's how you grew up on the south side of Chicago. You grew up with your family right there. The great aunt who taught me to play the piano, Robbie, she's one of the first stories. She was one of my first adversaries, one of the people who kicked me in the butt a little bit at the age of 4 when I thought I would be a great pianist, and she just didn't appreciate it. But I talk about Dandy, my paternal grandfather, who, again, we would go visit Dandy and Grandma every Sunday. That was part of the ritual. You know, we had dinner at my father's parents' house. So we had a lot of traditions and routines in our little poor little way. They weren't grand, but they were just
Cleavers, though.
We were the poor, and Barack has always called us the Cleavers, without the picket fence and the father with the suit, and said my father had a blue uniform. But it was a very, it was a very tight-knit situation. But Dandy, and I would notice, was a very grumpy man. He was angry and bitter in ways that were unexplainable. And a lot of times he would take that anger out on my grandmother, not in a physical way, but just in a grumpy, cranky kind of way. And I always, at a very young age, I was always amazed at how other adults kind of sat by and didn't intervene. Oh, but not Michelle, I was the one who was gonna be like, Dandy, you need to stop. I don't know why you're yelling, and you sit down, and and he would let me, because I'm sure I was about this big and probably cute, and having somebody come up and stop yelling probably amused him at some level. But my parents would explain to us. We would leave a family gathering, and they'd say, well, let me tell you a little bit about why Dandy might be upset. Because Dandy was a brilliant man, grew up in South Carolina in the South, and he was one of the many millions of black folks who migrated north in hopes of getting jobs, but couldn't get a job. He was smart. He should have gone to college. He probably should have been a professor. But that was the plight of black men, and still is today, in a culture of racism and inequality, where a lot of people don't get the opportunity, even if they have the skill. And what my parents helped me to realize is that there's something that happens to a man, a person, who knows deep inside that they are more than what their opportunities allow them to be. And for Dandy, it bubbled up in a discontent that he couldn't shake. And I was taught to understand this about my grandfather very early on, so that I could have the compassion and the empathy for him. Because as I said, what's important in this book is context. And I try to put context in this book because everybody's life has context. There's context. You can't judge somebody or know somebody just based on their actions. You have to know the full breadth of their experiences, and my parents taught me that.
What I got from it is, whether it was Robbie downstairs or Dandy or many other people that you mentioned in the book, that a lot of people are carrying their own broken dreams.
Absolutely.
And when people are carrying their broken dreams, you have to make room for their broken dreams. But I thought, so often you get in conversations, particularly with white people, who have said to me when I was doing shows on racism, like, that was then, what do we have to do with slavery? I wasn't there then. Your explanation of what happens to a family that isn't allowed to have the opportunities, I think is, puts it in context.
And I just think of what networking opportunities, what additional information, what exposure I missed because my grandfathers didn't have the opportunity. And still, here I am. And this is one of the things why I want people to know the rawness of my story, especially young girls, is because I was that kid that didn't have networks, didn't have grandfathers with trust funds and big fancy names, and that doesn't define who you are. It didn't define them. Sadly, they didn't know that. They didn't have the opportunity, the love, and the support that I had. That's what they blessedly...
That's why they were working so hard to make sure you had it.
That's why they worked so hard to change our lot. And that's one thing I understood, that when I saw my grandparents and heard their sacrifice, my notion was, oh, little girl, you better get that star.
Yeah.
Because they're counting on you to get that star.
Yeah. It's what Maya Angelou used to say, you've been paid for.
Yeah.
You've been paid for. And then when you were 10 years old, you had this experience, Gail and I talk about this too, you had this experience where a cousin, a distant relative says to you, how come you talk like a white girl?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
talking like a white girl. Which is something that a lot of white people are like, what do you mean? What does that sound like?
Yeah. Look at the girls looking. Anybody heard that before? Anybody say you talk like a white girl? Why are you talking like a white girl?
And I talk about that incident as one of the challenges that you have as a striving kid in, now I grew up in a black community, but the truth is that if you grow up in a community other than the one that you're striving, if you're moving away from that community, sometimes there's a pullback where folks don't understand, like, where do you think you're going?
Yeah,
no. Is essentially the question, who do you think you are?
Mm-hmm.
And I confronted that question early and often. And it was disconcerting at 10 because you're trying to be just a regular 10-year-old kid. You don't want to be the kid at the family barbecue that's that kid
talking all white.
So in many ways, when you grow up, or at least when I grew up, I had to learn how to be bilingual. I had to learn how to talk in a way that would get me to school without getting my butt kicked.
Yeah.
And I had to talk in a certain way that would allow me to continue to strive and get those gold stars and to, push towards what my parents and grandparents had hoped for me, because also the way I talked was something that was drilled into me by Dandy. Dandy was the one who was like, we talk proper English in this house. You couldn't walk into that house, slipping and sliding and slurring and done. He was such a force intellectually that he shaped us into who we had to be as intellectuals.
And later, when Barack Obama entered the public stage, you say you watched this same sentiment play out with him. Well, why you talk like that? You're so white, not black enough.
And knowing that always comes. That with any black person that you see striving and excelling and understanding that context, or any person from an underserved experience, there is always that pull of pulling away from who you were. I talk about the fact that in Barack's first congressional race, which was a sad, sad disappointment to me, he was running against Bobby Rush. All of these folks have known us for quite some time. And the biggest criticism they had of Barack, who was a state senator at the time, that he was this Harvard-trained know-it-all trying to come in and blah-de-da-de-da.
Yeah.
I mean, their major attack was him, that he was too smart, he was too educated, that we couldn't trust him. And those kind of attacks, worse than anything anybody from any other party or any other has said about me, to have your own community tell you that you aren't black enough, that you aren't good enough, that you don't fit in, is probably one of the most hurtful things you can do, especially as a young person, when in your mind, you were doing exactly what you thought the community wanted you to do.
Right.
Excel, achieve,
Strive.
and serve.
Yes.
So I put that out there because it's an important thing for communities of color to think about. It's one thing to compete.
All the girls are nodding their heads because they know
this is the life. This is why I'm saying
these are smart girls who've heard that, right?
Heard it in your own families, maybe in your own houses. It is something that we all deal with, and it's important for the rest of the world to understand this, as they understand the challenges, the potential anger, the disappointment that comes in this country when you were striving against who you are supposed to be and where you come from, and all those identities getting mushed up together.
And trying to navigate it all.
Trying to navigate it all and doing it throughout your entire life.
My big concern was being able to talk about everything I wanted to talk about.
Right.
So, okay.
We're going to keep it moving.
Going. After high school,
book.
It's a big book. Right. After high school, and I was sorry when it ended, actually. After high school, you went to Princeton, then Harvard Law School, and then you joined this prestigious law firm in Chicago. Now this, when I read this, I put 3 circles around it, 2 stars, and I went, oh my God. You write on page 132, I hated being a lawyer.
Oh God, yeah.
I wanted a life.
Sorry, lawyers.
I wanted a life. I wanted to feel whole. So I wanted to shout that from the mountaintops because I thought so many people are going to read this who are in jobs that they hate, but they feel like they have to continue. And I was wondering for you, your parents have invested everything. You've led us through everything they've given up, they've sacrificed. How did you come to that
decision? Did it happen all at once? Do you go to work, or do you start feeling it and then just one day say, I hate being a lawyer?
It took a lot to get to that point, to be able to say that to myself.
Yes.
Out loud to myself, because I still couldn't say it to the world. But in the book, I take you on the journey of who that little girl, the striving star-getter, became, which was what a lot of many hard-driving kids become. I became a box checker. I became someone who understood that there was a payoff for effort, and I enjoyed that. Just like, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a lawyer. Well, that sounds good. And I responded to the reaction that I got without thinking about who I was and even knowing that I had the right to think about it. So I went through much of my life until I became a lawyer, checking boxes. Get good grades, I can do that, check. Go apply to the best schools in the country, get into Princeton, check. Get there, what's your major? Let me do something that's gonna get me good grades so I can get into law school, I guess. Did it, check. Got through law school, check. I was checking boxes and not thinking about who I was gonna be. And in the book, I talk about some of the things that made me wake up, because I wasn't a swerver. I wasn't somebody that was gonna take risks. I became risk averse, and all this talent and all this opportunity, I narrowed myself to being this thing I thought I should be. And it took loss. I talk about losses that I had in my life that made me think, have you ever stopped to think about who you wanted to be? And I realized that I had not. But where was I? I was sitting on the 47th floor of a high-rise office building, going over cases and writing memos, and I just landed there. It was almost like I got plucked out and I was there and I had nothing to do with it.
What I loved about it is it says to every person reading the book and beyond that you have the right to change your mind.
You have the right to change your mind. Oh gosh, yeah.
You have the right to change your mind.
Here's the thing, because when you're becoming, and you're always becoming, these little moments, this is just a part of the story. So I had to tell myself, even though I'd invested a lot of money and time in becoming a lawyer, that's okay. That was worth it. That was an important part of my life.
Were you afraid?
I was scared to death.
Okay.
Because my mother, who was not very, she didn't comment on the choices that we made. She was just like, live and let live. You got to make your choices. But there's a scene where I'm really struggling with it, and I finally share with her that I'm not happy and passionate. And for the first time, my mother's driving me from the airport after I was doing document production in Washington, D.C. And by then I was like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. I can't sit in a room and look at documents. I won't get into what that is for the young people, but it's deadly. It's deadly boring, document production. And I shared with her in the car that I'm just not happy and I don't feel my passion. And my mother, my uninvolved, live and let live mother said, make the money, worry about being happy later. And I was like, oh. And I was like, oh, okay. But then in the book, I talk about how indulgent that must have felt to my mother.
Yes.
To hear me talking about passion and what I cared about when she had sacrificed and my parents had sacrificed. They didn't put it like that. And I don't think she was thinking about it in those terms, but when she said that, I thought, wow, where did I come from with all my luxury and wanting my passion?
The luxury to even be able to decide.
The luxury to even be able to decide, where my mother didn't get to go back to work and start even finding herself until after she got us into high school. She made that sacrifice. So yes, it was hard, and I felt guilty, and I started writing a journal, and then I met this guy, Barack Obama. He was also part of the shaking up my little box checking world, because he was the opposite of a box checker. He was swerving all over the place. I didn't even know. It's like, how did you get here? And what did you do that? He was doing the opposite of what I was doing in my life.
You write about meeting him. I had constructed my existence carefully tucking and folding every loose and disorderly bit of it, as if building some tight and airless piece of origami. Barack was like a wind that threatened to unsettle everything. At first, she didn't like being unsettled.
Oh God, no. Unsettled. That was a lack of control, you know. Barack and other people slowly taught me to unwind a little bit. That part of what you earn, part of this work of becoming and making the sacrifices is that you can try some things. You can step outside the box and things won't fall apart. But when you're a little kid from the south side of Chicago and every dime matters, and you know, you can be categorized and dropped and you can lose opportunities. I felt like I didn't have the luxury.
This I love so much on page 112. You describe a moment that cracks me up, I tell you. You say, I woke one night to find him, Barack, staring at the ceiling, his profile lit by the glow of streetlights outside. He looked vaguely troubled, as if he were pondering something deeply personal. Was it our relationship? The loss of his father? Hey, what are you thinking about? I whispered. He turned to look at me, his smile a little sheepish. Oh, he said, I was just thinking about income inequality.
That's my honey. That was Barack, you know. I mean, you know, here's this guy, and at the time I was a young professional, all right? This is when I was coming into my own, right? I had a job that paid more than my parents ever made in their lives. I was rolling with the bourgeois class. I mean, my friends owned condos. I had a Saab, which was a cool car back then. I don't know what's cool these days, but a Saab back in the day, oh yeah, I had a Saab. And, you know, that was sort of that was the next step. Sort of, okay, you get married, you have a lovely home, and on and on and on. And yes, the bigger problems of the world were important, but the more important thing was where you were going in your career. And I talk about Barack meeting some of my friends and how that didn't really play out because he's this serious sort of income inequality, and my friends are like, I just went writing.
You really let us in into the relationship. I mean, down to the proposal and everything, you let us in. And you also write about some major differences between the two of you when you started out. You say, I understood it was nothing but good intentions that would lead him to say, I'm on my way, or almost home.
Oh, gosh.
And for a while, I believed those words. I'd give the girls their nightly bath, but delay bedtime so that they could wait up to give their dad a hug. And then you describe this scene where you'd wait it up. He says, I'm on my way. I'm on my way. He doesn't come. And then you turn out the lights. I could hear them click off the way you wrote it. You could hear those lights click. You went to bed, and you were mad.
I was mad. This was in the time when we had married and he was in politics, and, you know, I had to go through the struggle that now that I had sort of, we've skipped parts where I actually started to swerve and started to shape my own career.
Yes.
But at a point when you get married and you have kids, you know, your whole plan, once again, gets unended because now you're a mom. And I love being a mother. I love being at home with my girls. I was a working mother, juggling everything. I still had my careers. I was running a nonprofit organization. I went on to have, you know, some wonderfully interesting opportunities and career opportunities. But that reality of when you get married, especially you get married to somebody who has a career that swallows up everything, which is what politics is. Yeah. I talk about the challenges
and
of
finding your
really
footing
finding my footing, finding my voice in a very powerful, with a very powerful personality, who was Barack Obama, who taught me how to swerve, but he also, his swerving just sort of, you know, I'm flailing in the wind, and now I've got 2 kids, and I'm trying to hold everything down, and he's traveling back and forth from Washington or Springfield or wherever it was, given whatever office he was holding at the time. And he had this wonderful optimism about time, you know, that he thought there was way more of it than there really was, and he would fill it up constantly. And I talk about how he constantly was, he's a plate spinner, I described it. Somebody that, you know, in the circus, you've got plates on a stick, and, you know, it's not exciting unless one's about to fall, and if there isn't any, then you put another plate up and you're spinning it, and that's my husband. That's who the box checker married. And now we have 2 kids, and his idea of coming home, I learned, was very different from my idea of coming home. He would be optimistic and say, I'm on my way. But then I'd learned that he was in a banquet hall, you know, and hadn't like gone to the valet to get the car when he told me he was on his way home in 20 minutes.
He
and
meant, I intend to come
I
home.
intend to come home. I have a plan to come home.
Yes.
But it's not 20 minutes, and it's actually an hour. So I had to learn how to first deal with that, and we talk about the work that we had to do as a couple, counseling we had to do to kind of work through this stuff.
Tell us about that pivotal moment you had in counseling. I thought that that was crucial, and I know that so many people reading Becoming are going to see themselves, if not in that particular story. You say, after couples counseling, instead of making a case against Barack, which you went to counseling thinking once you told the counselor.
Well, because that's what everybody in counseling does. You go because the counselor's going to tell the other person. Would you tell him about himself? And she's like, would you tell her about herself? And lo and behold, counseling wasn't that at all. It was about me exploring my sense of happiness and my voice, the notion that you come to a relationship whole, and that I couldn't look to Barack and he couldn't look to me to be everything, that we had to make our everythings on our own. And what clicked in me was that I need support, and I need some from him, but I need to figure out how to build my life in a way that works for me. So what we decided to do at bedtime was that I started setting hard and fast, because the kids were little at the time, and anybody with little kids knows that bedtime is magical. You do not keep kids up, because mothers need their children to go to sleep. And my kids were good sleepers. They went to bed at 7:30, and after that, I had my life. So 7:30 was bedtime. And it was like, if you want to see them and if you want to be here, then you have to get here. We're not waiting for you. You've got to catch up to us. And I think I say that I knew that in this life that this husband I was with, this swerving dervish of a person, that I would have to ground myself and my kids firmly somewhere and have him catch up to us.
But what the most important thing I think you said about this was that we live by the paradigms we know. And in Barack's childhood, his father disappeared, his mother came and went. She was devoted to him, but was never really tethered to him. As far as he was concerned, there was nothing wrong with that. And there you grew up. Ooh. You all are the force, you're the square. And meanwhile, you've been raised inside this...
The 4 of us...
The tight weave of your own family.
Tight weave with all my extended family, and Sunday dinners and birthdays and the way things are. And this guy, it's like, whew, how you made it, you know. Mm-hmm. He, you know, his mother, you know, was in Indonesia. He was raised by his grandparents. He didn't know his father. And yet and still, even with his context, he was a solid guy. Yeah. You know, realizing that there are so many ways to live this life.
So his paradigm meant that he approached family life differently than you did.
Exactly.
That's what you realized.
And it wasn't better or worse, it was different.
But you also said, when it came down to it, I felt vulnerable when he was away. Meanwhile, I'd been raised inside this tight weave. And I thought that was kind of amazing to hear a modern woman, first lady, admit that.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a real emotion, vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And this notion that you can't feel vulnerable. I feel vulnerable all the time. Mm-hmm. And learning how to express that to my husband, that part of my frustration, you know, you could play the tough woman, which is what a lot of us do. It's like, let me act like I can do it all, and I don't miss you. No, it's good. You can travel, and, you know, but when I started to tap into those parts of me that missed him, and the sadness that came from that, you know, so that he could understand that in a way that he didn't understand distance in the same way. You know, he grew up without his mother in his life for most of his years, and he knew his mother loved him dearly, right? I always thought love was up close. This is love. Love is the dinner table. Love is, you know, love is 3 pints of ice cream for your report card. Love is consistency. It is presence. So I had to share that vulnerability that, you know, you also learn to love, you love differently. And I share that in the book because I think that's an important part of my journey of becoming, understanding how to become us.
Yes, and you know what was so valuable to me, and I think for everyone else who reads it, is that nothing really changed. You just changed your
I changed my
You changed your
perception.
perception of what was happening.
And I also share this
And
because
that made you happier.
Yeah, and young couples, I know I talk to young couples all the time, especially we are surrounded by young people that are starting their relationships, starting marriage, starting families. And a lot of the reason why I share this is because people look to me and Barack as the ideal relationship. I know there's hashtag relationship goals out there, and it's sort of like, whoa, people, slow down. Marriage is hard. And I think that we have a responsibility to sort of talk about the journey of having a good, strong relationship. I tell young people all the time that in a marriage, if you are lucky to be married 50 years and 20 of those years are horrible, you're doing great, you know? And when you say that to a young couple, they go, well, what would I want to do that for? Because I'm like, 30 of those years are awesome, awesome. And what you build together can be awesome, but I say that to say that marriage isn't a cakewalk. It's hard, and there are gonna be bumps and bruises, and you have to rediscover yourself, because in order for your relationship to grow, you have to constantly be growing and changing and evolving and becoming, and hopefully you have a partner who
You even say you all argue differently.
Oh God, yes.
Yes.
Yes. We go into that. I am like a lit match. It's like poof. And he wants to rationalize everything, you know, which is what you learn in a relationship. So you also have to learn how to argue. He has to learn to give me like a couple minutes or hour before he should even come in the room when he's made me mad. And he has to understand that he can't convince me out of my anger, that he can't logic me into some other feeling, that my feelings are mine.
And him being calm and rational just makes you more irritated. Yeah.
And, you know, these are things I share because I share them with my friends anyway, because that's the other thing. That's how you talk through. That's how you get through those moments. And I want young couples, as they read this, to sort of see themselves and to see the choices that they're making as they go along. And if they can see that in me and Barack, you know, maybe it will give them something to think about when they hit the bumps in their own lives.
I love that, and I love how you were always rationalizing between Mary Tyler Moore, who, look her up, Google, Mary Tyler Moore, being Mary Tyler Moore, and Marion, trying to balance that, which every woman is still trying to do.
Yeah, Mary Tyler Moore, like Oprah, was my idol from TV days, because she was the only woman who wasn't trying to get married and have kids. And even though I always wanted to get married and have kids, there was something about her independence in that day and age where she was battling with Mr. Grant, and you know, she wasn't the typical Mrs. Cleaver, and you know, she wasn't just in an apron, and she wasn't even thinking about getting married. But then I had this other role model of a woman, which was Marion Robinson, my mother, who was the sacrificer, and she was my role model. And she didn't work until we went away to school. And there were those competing notions of who I wanted to be as a modern day woman with choices that neither Mary Tyler Moore or Marion Robinson ever had. The choices I know that I have as a modern day woman, the freedoms, the changing societal norms, sometimes makes it harder to choose. You know, my mom would always say, you know, I don't know how you do it. You young people, you have so many choices. And there's something about choice sometimes that is difficult. Because sometimes if you know what you're supposed to be and there's a limit to what you can be, you just be that. And a lot of my parents and our grandparents' generations, that's how they treated life. My mother was like, I can be a secretary or I can be a teacher. Those were basically her options growing up. Rare was the Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, those women in their generation were so rare, which is why you need to know who these women are, because for them to be where they are, given where they've come from, you know, that is an incredible oddity. But now I'm of the generation of choice. And what comes with choice is the challenge of the choice, because you can't have it all at the same time. And that's one thing, especially the young girls, you can't have it all at the same time. It's impossible to have everything at the same time, but you can have things in moments in time, and you learn to embrace those moments and get ready for the next phase of when you can have more or something different.
You've never been a fan of the swerve. You said that.
I've learned.
You've learned. So What was the argument or the conversation that got you to swerve to say yes to him running for the presidency? Because every time, you mentioned in the book that every time someone would ask him, he'd say, well, it's a family decision,
Yeah,
which was
right.
code for...
It's like...
Which was code for...
Thunk.
Code for, if Michelle says I can, I can.
Yeah, which imagine having that burden. But what ultimately, every time he would run for something, and I talk about that question that would come, could he, should he, would he, that was, that happened when he wanted to run for state senate, and then he wanted to run for Congress, and then he was running for the U.S. Senate. And I never wanted to be involved in politics. I had seen politics. I grew up in Chicago, rough and tumble politics, and I knew that Barack was a decent man, smart as all get out, but politics was ugly and nasty, and I didn't know that my husband's temperament would mesh with that, and I didn't want to see him in that environment. But then on the flip side, you see the world and the challenges that the world is facing. By then I had started working in public service. I had worked in the city. I saw the inequalities. I saw the challenges. The longer you live and read the paper and live in the world, you know that the problems are big and complicated. And I thought, well, what person do I know who has the gifts that this man has? The gifts of decency first and foremost, of empathy second, of high intellectual ability. This man reads and remembers everything, is articulate, had worked in the community,
In his quiet moments is thinking about income inequality.
And really is passionately feels like this is my responsibility. How do you say no to that? So I had to take off my wife hat and put on my citizen hat, as I've said, and say, how can I stand in the way if I know that this man could do good? Yeah. Because the choice for him not to do it would help me and my girls. And that felt selfish and small. And I couldn't be the person that stopped it.
Describe for us that moment when you're standing with Cornelius. I call it the we're not in Kansas anymore moment. You're standing with Cornelius and you see the motorcade for the first time.
Cornelius was one of my Secret Service agents at the time. We had gotten, because of death threats and all this in the campaign, I think Barack was one of the earliest presidential candidates to be assigned a Secret Service detail, and eventually I was assigned it because my crowds over the course of the campaign had gotten big, and there was, discontent, and I go through that. There's a whole chapter where I talk about the bumps and the bruises that I dealt with on the campaign trail. But we both had Secret Service, and this was the day after Barack was elected. He was president-elect. It was the day that we went to visit the White House, to visit the sitting president, George and Laura Bush, and to give you a sense of how abrupt the transition is, even though you're running for this office for 2 years, but that's all you're doing. And it's just really just a blur, because you never think about it, and you don't have time, nor are you allowed the opportunity to even imagine what you need to do if you win, because then you'd be called presumptuous. So you can't really even plan your life. And then the election happens, and the next day your husband is president-elect of the United States of America, and your life blows up like that. It is over. And the first sign of that was I was standing in Signature at Reagan National, because I was meeting Barack in Washington. So I had flown in, and he was meeting me at the airport. One of my detail leaders at the time, Cornelius, said, "Ma'am, your life is about to change," or whatever the quote is in the book. And then the presidential motorcade pulls up. And if any of you have ever had the experience of seeing a presidential motorcade, and all the people who think, oh, I want the president to come visit me, and it's like, have you seen what it's going to do to your town to have the commander-in-chief of the United States of America in your neighborhood? Well, this was a 20-car, and it was comical. I was standing there, and there was one car and another car, and then there were the police cars and 2 limousines that were like tanks with flags on them, and then there was a cat car with men with black suits with machine guns. All of them, windows down, guns out, in the back, like, I will kill you. I was like, that's in the, and then there was a brown car and a clown car, and and at the end, to top it all off, there was an ambulance. So just so that you know, the President of the United States, just as a reminder, if he gets killed or hurt, there's an ambulance with him all the time. You know, all of that was very sobering. And I was like, this is our new life. And he said, yes, ma'am. Please get in the car. We were shot out of the cannon. And you know, that became our life for the next 8 years.
Did you feel the pressure being the first Black family? Because, you know, because we've all been raised with, you've got to work twice as hard, to get half as far. And before you came out, I was saying, meticulous, not a misstep.
Do you think that was an accident?
Yeah, I know it was no accident, but
yes.
Did you feel the pressure of that?
Absolutely. We felt the pressure from the minute we started to run. We talk about that and just how, first of all, we had to convince our base that a Black man could win. It wasn't even winning over Iowa. We had to win over Black people, because Black people like Dandy, my grandparents, once again, who I understand the context, they never believed this could happen. They wanted it for us, but their lives had told them no, never. Hillary was the safer bet for them because she was known. You know, the opening your hearts up to the hope that America would put down its racism for a Black man, I think that hurt too much. And it wasn't until Iowa, when Barack won Iowa, that people thought, okay, maybe so.
Did you believe in the beginning? Because you say that you didn't believe he could win.
One of the reasons, the other reason I said yes was like, okay, we're gonna do this, he's gonna lose, and that is that. So I thought I had it all figured out. It's like, okay, one more time, my friend, one more run.
Was it Iowa that changed you too?
Yes.
Was it after Iowa you thought you could do it?
The entire Iowa experience, and it was, you know, the act of letting go of my assumptions and misperceptions about people and walking. Back then, I was just Michelle Obama. Nobody knew Obama, Barack Obama. We were going into Iowa, people, you know? Iowa, the most Midwestern state in the Union, and we went all over Iowa. Mm-hmm. And we started in little living rooms where I was talking to moms and grandpas, and what I did in those moments was I told my story. And what I want these kids to understand was, like, I completely told those stories to people, and it resonated. Who I was them. The story of my grandfather and a working class struggle, and growing up poor and wanting to do the best and living up to the standards of your parents, and hard work and honesty being at the core of how we were raised. You could see people's faces turning every time I talk to people. They'd be like, and then, oh, I know her. I understand her. I get her.
Because you're just like me.
Just like me.
You're just like me.
If you tap into your true story and share that truth, it resonates with
that's
people.
What becoming does.
Regardless of color and location and region, and those are all that stuff is stuff.
You know what? You know how good this book is? This is how good this book is.
How good?
Tell us, Oprah. This book is so good that it reminded me of going to see Bruce Springsteen. If you all have never seen Bruce Springsteen's show, Bruce Springsteen does this amazing thing on stage where he unveils his life in such a way that he makes you think more about your own. So I'm like crying about my hometown.
Well, there were times, and even listening, because I was at some of the passages after listening to Bruce's storytelling, I went back and I was like, that's how you spin out a tale.
That's what this is.
So thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, it makes me think about my own becoming, and I think everybody who reads it will think that. This is what was so poignant to me. There was only one time during the presidency that your husband summoned you. You were at some event and you got the message that he wanted to see you in the office, and that was for?
The Newtown shooting, when, which was probably the hardest day of his presidency, and mind you, to put it in context, we had been grieving losses all throughout our presidency. Shootings, senseless shootings over and over again on military bases, in theaters, in mosques, in religious. We were so exhausted. from not the grieving with the families and with the victims, but with the inevitable inaction that would follow.
How many times do you have to do it before people get it?
And it fell into a pattern that I don't know that the rest of the country understood was happening. There would be a tragedy, tragic shooting, senseless because somebody had an automatic weapon. Something that you wonder, what do you need that for? Whether you hunt or whatever, somebody had an automatic weapon and they went somewhere and they were unhinged and they killed a lot of people and no one could stop them until too many people were killed. And there's outrage and shock and there's news coverage for 3 days and there's talk about doing something to ban something, and then the NRA runs ads, and then a week goes by, there's a funeral, there's mourning, there's pictures of the dead, and then a week, 2 weeks later, we move on. And when you have to go through this, you see that pattern, and you see it becoming a pattern. The media turns it into the pattern, the politicians turn it into the pattern, and citizens who are not harmed turn it into a pattern. And we thought Newtown was gonna be different. Not to mention all the shootings that were going on in neighborhoods, in my neighborhood, all over the place, kids being killed every day by assault weapons that don't even get reported, right? Kids you assume were just gangbangers and just nobodies. And we thought, well, maybe these suburban white kids, quite frankly, babies shot in their classroom at school would be different. And that's when Barack called me in, because it had just happened.
And he had seen the pictures?
He had seen, well, when you're the president of the United States, you see everything, and you know everything, and you know it in grave detail.
So my question is, when the weight of the world is on his shoulders, and you're the shoulders that he's leaning on, how did you carry that? How do you carry that?
Trying to be the calm in his swerve. You know, doing what I was taught was that, you know, when the leaves are blowing and the wind is rough, being a steady trunk in his life and creating that order that he didn't have, that brings calm. You know, family dinners. One of the things I brought into the White House was that strict code of, you got to catch up with us, dude. This is when we're having dinner. Yes, you were president, but you can bring your butt from the Oval Office and sit down and talk to your children, because children bring solace, and being able to turn your sights off of the issues of the day and focus on, you know, saving the tigers, because that was one of Malia's primary goals. She advocated throughout his presidency to make sure that the tigers were saved. Hearing about what happened with what school friend, you know, falling into other people's lives, immersing yourself into the reality and the beauty of your children and your family, and those are the kind of things that I tried to provide.
They keep you stable.
Plus, on the East Wing side, our motto was, we have to do everything excellently. If we do it, because the First Lady doesn't have to do anything. We were clear that what we were gonna do was gonna have impact, and it was gonna be positive, because the West Wing had enough going on. So we wanted to be the happy side of the House. And we were the happy side. You'd have national security advisors coming over to brief me about something. They'd fall into my office that was actually beautifully decorated, lots of flowers and apples, and we were always laughing. And they sit down for a briefing and they wouldn't want to leave. And it's like, oh, we're done, gentlemen. And it's like, we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back to the West Wing.
It's like,
you gotta go.
I gotta get to this section.
So I tried to be calm for my husband and not add to his stress.
That's how you were the shoulder. Yeah.
That's what I tried to do.
There's a section in the book that's obviously going to be lots of the book is going to be talked about, a lot of your personal revelations, but this one, I can just see them on certain news channels. We're going to have a field day with this. You write about Donald Trump stoking the false notion that your husband was not born in this country. On page 353, you say, Donald Trump, with his loud and reckless innuendos, was putting my family's safety at risk, and for this, I'd never forgive him. Why was it important for you to say that at this time?
Because I don't think he knew what he was doing. That for him it was a game. And for the commander-in-chief, which he now is, The threats and security risks that you face as the commander-in-chief, not even within your own country, but around the world, are real. And your children are at risk. And the difference, when you're now in that position, you understand that while you live in a bubble, your children have to live outside of the bubble. And in order for my children to have a normal life, even though they had security, they were in the world in a way that we weren't. And so to think that some crazed person who was ginned up to think that somehow my husband was a threat to the country's security, and to know that we have shootings anyway, and to know that my children every day had to go to a school that was guarded but not secure, that they had to go to soccer games and parties and travel and go to college, that this person would not take into account that this is not a game, is something that I want the country to understand. You know, I want the country to take this in a way that I didn't say out loud, but I'm saying it now. It was reckless, and it put my family in danger, and it wasn't true. And he knew it wasn't true. And we have to stop for a moment. People of all persuasions, of any political party, we have to wonder, what are we doing? So yes, I put that in the book intentionally, and I hope it is discussed. And I hope that we're very careful as we disagree with each other. Because again, we can disagree. We can disagree with the President of the United States without putting him in harm's way.
Yeah.
And anytime someone makes threats like that or accusations that can unhinge people, you're putting him in jeopardy.
And hurt families.
Yeah, we had a bullet shot into the Yellow Oval during our tenure there. A high-powered weapon. Several streets down. By then, security hadn't shut the streets down facing the Truman balcony that far, because up until then, people didn't have access to high-powered machine guns. So the distance of closure that they had, the level of patrol didn't go far back enough. Well, there was a lunatic that came and parked right in front, way down, I can't remember which street, on Constitution, shot from Constitution. The bullet hole hit the upper left corner. I see it to this day. The window of the Truman balcony where my family sat. It was really the only place we could get outdoor space. And fortunately, nobody was out there at the time. No one was hurt, thankfully. The shooter was caught. But I lived with that reality. Maybe got reported a little bit. I don't even know if people remember. But it took months to replace that glass, because it's bomb-proof glass. It took months to replace it. And I had to look at that bullet hole as a reminder of what we were living with every day. Now, the current president didn't see that hole. He didn't live through it. He was an outside agitator playing a game. And we cannot play games like that in this country, in this time where we are not going to do anything about high-powered assault weapons. We can't play those games with each other, not just with the President of the United States, but we can't play those games with one another, because bad things happen when people are afraid and when they're made to be afraid. So yeah, I wanted to talk about that.
You end the book saying, you talk about also what will last. You are mulling over this question of what will last. And one of the things that has lasted with you, you say, is the sense of optimism. I continue to keep myself connected to a force that's larger and more potent than any other election or leader or news story, and that's optimism for me. This is a form of faith and an antidote to fear, you say. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel that same sense of optimism for our country, who we are as a nation are becoming? Do you feel that?
Yes. And we have to feel that optimism for these kids. We're setting the table for them. And we can't hand them crap. We have to hand them hope. Progress isn't made through fear. We're experiencing that right now. And fear is false. Fear is the coward's way of leadership. But all these kids are born into this world with a sense of hope and optimism, no matter where they're from. how tough their stories are. They think they can be anything because we tell them that. So now we have a responsibility to be optimistic and to operate in the world in that way. So yes.
You feel optimistic for our country?
We have to be.
Michelle Obama, becoming Michelle Obama. Great. Ah, yes. Good job, you. Ah. Good job. Good job.